Right, welcome everyone. Welcome to our webinar, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. We're here today to talk about the biodiversity net gain consultation for nationally significant infrastructure projects. The consultation's out, and we'll be hearing all about it from various people from Defra and from industry. And to welcome my co-chair, Lucy.
Thank you, Julia, and it's great to see that this consultation's now been launched. So good morning, everyone. I'm Lucy Morton. I'm the Divisional Development Director for Environment, Nature and Consents at Mott MacDonald. And we'll be hearing from the Defra team about the consultation and their reasons behind the questions.
We'll then be hearing from colleagues from industry representing the water, transport and energy sector. We'll be hearing directly from them what they think about the consultation questions and what they think BNG for nationally significant infrastructure projects could work. And finally, we'll be hearing from Nick White from Natural England and Tom Butterworth from Arup. So that's quite the agenda.
But the launch of the consultation on BNG for NSIPs is not the only policy game in town at the moment. So this is one consultation amidst an almost unprecedented time of policy change for planning, consents and development. And we'll touch on that at the start of today for the wider policy change context.
Before we get going, some housekeeping. We'd really like to hear from you. So if you'd like to ask your questions, please do send them in. Lucy and I will be monitoring the questions and we will try and answer as many as we can. The webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the CIM YouTube channel. Now, you'll hear various acronyms throughout today: BNG for biodiversity net gain, NSIPs for nationally significant infrastructure projects. If there's others that you hear about, just pop it in the chat if you're not sure. We'll have a look at that and we'll try and get to those and work our way through them. Right, let's get going. We'd like to welcome the Defra team. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Thanks, Julia and Lucy. Yeah, thanks so much for having us and for everyone taking the time this morning to join. I'm Lucy Petley and I lead the sustainable planning team here at Defra. And as part of that, I have the privilege of leading the work on biodiversity net gain for NSIPs. But the really hard legwork is done by my wonderful team who are also on this call. So I'll hand over to Chloe and then Nicole to introduce themselves.
Morning, Julia and Lucy and everyone on the call. I'm Chloe Jones. I am part of Lucy's team leading on BNG for NSIPs, as well as some other sort of wider aspects of planning reform policy. It's really great to be here, and I'll pass to Nicole in my team.
Morning, everyone. Great to be here as well. I'm Nicole Weir. I'm a senior policy advisor at Defra, and I work on BNG for NSIPs in Chloe's team. Thanks very much.
It's great to have you here, Lucy, Chloe and Nicole. And we'll get started by that first question. So this is a time of policy change. Could you just start us off by just giving us that wider picture of the policy change landscape that that is sitting sort of alongside and around what's happening with the BNG consultation for NSIPs?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, as of today, we are a year into this government. So I think it would be almost more surprising if we weren't in a state of sort of significant policy change, given that. There's obviously the Planning and Infrastructure Bill going through Parliament at the moment, and that's sort of another piece of work that my team and I have been working very closely with MHCLG on. So conscious of lots of changes to the sort of process for NSIP consenting, particularly in this context, but also lots of interest in the Nature Restoration Fund as part of that bill. So worth just sort of saying up front, I think that biodiversity net gain and the Nature Restoration Fund are two very different things. Biodiversity net gain for TCPA obviously applies to most developments under that act. And our intention is for biodiversity net gain to also apply to NSIPs, which is what the consultation is looking for views on. The Nature Restoration Fund will cover much more specific circumstances where an environmental delivery plan is in place, and mainly relating to sort of protected sites and species where development isn't able to go ahead. So it's sort of trying to tackle a very different issue to biodiversity net gain. I should say, though, we are working very closely with the Nature Restoration Fund teams, both in Defra and in MHCLG, to make sure that sort of where possible we're aligned and to try to make the developer experience as straightforward as possible. So looking at sort of whether there's opportunities to pool money going through biodiversity net gain credits and the Nature Restoration Fund in terms of like what it's doing for nature restoration. But as you would imagine, it is in the planning bill at the moment. There's lots of secondary legislation that needs to follow and those environmental delivery plans. So we really are very much at the beginning of the Nature Restoration Fund phase, whereas we are further down the line on biodiversity net gain, with this already applying to TCPA and with it coming down the track for NSIPs.
Lucy, I think that's really helpful. And I think it's really helpful to just focus our minds on the fact that this is about the BNG for NSIPs consultation, and the fact that as of May next year, this is going to be sort of go live. So I think we've got a lot more road to travel in terms of understanding what the Nature Restoration Fund will be. So I think that's a good point to maybe sort of bring us into the conversation about the consultation itself. So the consultation includes many questions, sort of seeking views and opinions, as well as calls for evidence. So I wonder if you could just perhaps give us a little bit of an insight into what Defra's intention with this consultation actually is.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lucy. Yes, so Chloe and Nicole will shortly take you through some of those really sort of key questions that we're gathering views on. But I think sort of as sort of throughout this whole consultation, we're really keen that we do get people's sort of honest views and feedback. There are lots of elements of our proposals which I can be totally frank and open and say we do not have a fully formed policy position on. We want to hear from stakeholders across the different sectors involved how they think things could best work. And we are genuinely using this consultation as a route to consult. So just first and foremost, really, really interested in people's different perspectives on how they think some of the difficult and trickier issues in applying biodiversity net gain to NSIPs could be realised. I think throughout the consultation, we also talk quite a lot about sort of seeking evidence on things. And by that, we're not specifically talking about academic studies, although those are obviously welcomed. What we're really conscious of is that Chloe and I sit in the office in Westminster, Nicole sits in the office in York. We're not infrastructure sort of bread and butter people. We want to hear those case studies, that sort of not sort of hearsay evidence, that sort of thing that you guys are encountering in your day-to-day working lives, and for that to feed in and help shape and inform the policy that we develop from it.
That's really helpful to get that context. So Julia.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks so much, Lucy, because I think there's a variety of people listening in, and what we want to do is make sure that people get informed about the consultation and respond. I think that's the main thing for today. So we're really going to kind of go through those questions. And thank you for clarifying that point about evidence, because I was looking at thinking, oh, you know, do we need some like big study or something? And so your point about case studies or just experience and be able to feed that through to you is really, really welcome. Okay, so we've chosen, out of all of the questions in the consultation, we've chosen kind of 4 of the big ones. We can touch on others depending on the other questions that come in. But if I, let's go through the slides, because I think let's touch on those questions and then we can come back to them. Right. She says. I can show the slides. If you want to start talking, and then I'll share the slides.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll come in now, Julia. So yeah, one of our key topics that we would really like to get feedback on through this consultation is what is included in the pre-development biodiversity value. So we have proposed in the consultation that everything within the order limits is subject to the BNG requirement. So we propose that all habitats, whether it's retained, lost or enhanced, is subject to 10% BNG. And some of the rationale behind that, so you know sort of how we've got to that proposal, but also why we're asking about it. So this approach is consistent with what is required under other development types, under TCPA, where everything within the red line boundary is subject to BNG. We're also conscious that we want a system where developers and decision makers are completely clear on what is required for the BNG calculations. So we want to avoid uncertainty. We know that's not helpful. And we want a sort of streamlined BNG to sort of dock in a streamlined way into the DCO process. So we know that having the established order limit brings that kind of clarity. Other benefits are that it means that wider impacts beyond the sort of directly impacted sort of construction area are accounted for and can be remedied within that order limit because the boundary is large. Another little bit of background is that this was consulted on in the 2022 BNG consultation on TCPA and NSIPs. And we had mixed views responding to that question, but no clear alternative proposal that worked came forward. So that's where we've landed on proposing the order limits. But we know that this is a topic that lots of people have got views on, and we're really interested, as Lucy said, to understand the sort of on-the-ground experience and alternative proposals if there are any. So we know, for example, that obviously it's a much larger area often than the actual construction footprint. It can include surrounding land that's just used for access or for areas of landscaping, visual screening. We know that under the voluntary regime, some people are using the order limits, but other projects have used much smaller areas. So we're just really interested to hear more about what NSIPs have been doing, what they plan to do, whether there is any consensus around whether the order limits is the right direction or whether there is an alternative proposal that creates a clear and simple way of establishing a boundary that might be considered more proportionate. So that's one of our sort of key topics. It's kind of set out in the slide there, but we've got a question about that in the consultation. So we really welcome views on that and proposals for an alternative route if you don't agree that the order limits is the way. And then linked to that, we've just drawn out a particular type of land that is included within the order limits and therefore included within our proposal that BNG applies consistently, is on temporary use of land. So we know that NSIPs may need to use land temporarily during the construction phase, but then it's not kept for the permanent operation of the project. And under the current policy, BNG would apply as it would anywhere else within the order limits. So that means that any losses would need to be recorded in the metric, and any significant gains delivered on this land would need to be secured for 30 years. Non-significant gains wouldn't need to be. Again, we've had stakeholders highlight concerns that they might not be able to secure that land for 30 years because, you know, they might be looking to just restore it to the quality that it was in before they acquired it and then sort of sell it back, and the previous landowner may not wish to have had it secured for 30 years for that purpose of BNG. So we're asking the consultation for stakeholder views on how you currently approach BNG on land that's temporarily acquired, and whether there doesn't need to be any adjustments to how BNG applies for this land. And I'll pass to Nicole for a couple of the other topics that we're really keen to get views on.
Thanks, Chloe. So we thought it would be useful today to just talk through a little bit more about kind of why and how we're adapting the BNG process and the biodiversity gain plan approval process in particular to kind of fit with the NSIP consenting system. So it's slightly different to the kind of process that you might be familiar with the BNG system that's already in place for smaller developments. So the way that the Environment Act kind of mandatory BNG requirement for NSIPs will work once it's in place, the Secretary of State, who will be making a decision on NSIP applications, they won't be able to grant consent to that NSIP unless they're satisfied that the proposal meets the biodiversity gain objective. And so for that reason, that's why we're proposing that NSIPs need to submit a biodiversity gain plan with their application for a development consent order. So kind of at this application submission stage. This is really key to allow the Secretary of State to actually review those BNG proposals and be confident that that project can and will deliver at least 10% BNG. So in the consultation, we've set out some kind of proposed minimum information requirements that biodiversity gain plan at the submission stage will have to include. So again, it's slightly different to kind of under the Town and Country Planning Act existing BNG regimes. Please do kind of have a look in detail at that, at what we're proposing there. And it accounts for the fact that in many cases, we know that there are final details of a biodiversity gain plan that cannot be submitted until kind of after consent. So that could be things like details of offsite gains. We know that applicants may not have the full detail at that submission stage and kind of allocation of those offsite gains. And similarly, proof of credit purchase, we're not expecting NSIPs to buy the credits they need until later in the process. So that doesn't need to be submitted kind of upfront in the biodiversity gain plan at the submission stage. So kind of want to clarify that. We also recognise that kind of changes to NSIP projects, kind of the detailed design or the exact location of an NSIP scheme can change after the application is submitted and again, kind of after consent is granted as well. And that can impact kind of BNG calculations. So we're accounting for this in our proposals. So we're setting out in the consultation that NSIPs then can submit an updated biodiversity gain plan and metric to the relevant local planning authority for approval after they've been granted their development consent. So this is like a key flexibility that we're proposing to kind of make it suit the way that NSIPs kind of work and are consented and designed. And finally, where NSIPs are delivered in kind of phases, we're also proposing that this kind of post-consent biodiversity gain plan approval by the LPA could be submitted in phases if that works best for your development. And again, that's something you can discuss. The applicant and the LPA can kind of discuss to work out if that's something that works for that project in particular. So that's kind of a bit of, an overview of the biodiversity gain plan process and how it will work for NSIPs, because, that's another kind of key difference in BNG that you kind of may not be used to if you're used to working with BNG kind of under the Town and Country Planning Act development kind of work. So that please do submit any kind of comments on our proposals there through your consultation responses. As kind of Chloe and Lucy have said, we're really keen to learn from the experience of those already kind of delivering BNG voluntarily for NSIP schemes as well. So please do kind of submit as much kind of detailed information in your response on that.
Thank you. Just to say, sorry, go on.
No, come in, that's fine.
Just wanted to clarify, we've had a couple of questions just about the obviously change from the biodiversity gain plan, which is Town and Country Planning Act post 100%, but now with DCOs, and that relative kind of change between how much, if you like, at the DCO application and the flexibility that you've really built in, but also the change in terms of, we've had a couple of questions about what does getting LPA approval mean when you have a scheme that goes through, 9 or 10 different LPAs, and people are just slightly, there's been a couple of questions about, or if an LPA wants to see 10% in their patch, but you're actually delivering strategically 10% across your NSIP. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, really interesting questions and things that we're kind of thinking about and grappling with. So the mandatory BNG requirement will be a 10% requirement across the whole of the project. It won't be a 10% requirement for each LPA. Obviously, NSIPs are consented at the national scale and it applies to the project as a whole. So if you're submitting a biodiversity gain plan to the relevant LPA after consent, if there are multiple kind of host LPAs, then we've not set out in that much detail in our consultation exactly how this should work, because we want to kind of hear from experience of LPAs or developers working on kind of these long linear projects to see what works best already with kind of other plans that go to LPAs for approval. but we want this to be as a smooth process as possible. So we're hoping that we'll be able to have kind of one biodiversity game plan that's submitted to maybe a lead LPA, and they might consult with the other LPAs that are involved, to kind of keep that process smooth, and prevent duplicative work where game plans need to go to each LPA. We want to avoid that situation, but definitely if you've got experience of working with this for kind of other kind of like elements of an NSIP application, please do submit details of that in your kind of consultation response, and we'll look to kind of work with industry to produce some guidance on that to make sure it's kind of a smooth process as possible.
Yeah, and I think that guidance piece is particularly key. One thing for everyone to listening in, just be really encouraged by the fact that you've got a Defra team who are here, and it seems like they're really listening. So there's a lot within the consultation that seems to be questions about what do you think, rather than this is going to be the way. So we just really want to emphasize that point about tell us what you think. So thank you for that. Can I just jump on? We had another couple of questions about the biodiversity metric. Of course, that always gets the headlines about the biodiversity metric, and the way that the consultation response seems to be looking at using the town and country planning act metric. It's got in the consultation possibly a few amendments. What's your thinking about using that metric? Yeah, what's your that one?
Yeah, definitely. It's a really key element, and I can kind of talk through our thinking on the metric. So as you say, we are proposing to use the statutory biodiversity metric for NSIPs, so the same metric that's already in use for BNG for smaller development types. So we want to roll out BNG for NSIPs in a way that kind of broadly aligns with the existing BNG regime, and using the same metric is really a fundamental part of that. So it will ensure that we have kind of a consistent calculation tool, a consistent way of measuring biodiversity impacts and biodiversity gains, kind of regardless of the development type that's kind of impacting on those biodiversity, on those habitats. So I think that's really key. It also ensures that kind of the metric includes lots of elements that incentivizes developers to deliver their gains in specific ways. So it has these really important incentives for biodiversity gains to be delivered kind of as soon as possible and local to the development, and also in line with local nature recovery strategy kind of priorities. And so by using the same metric, we keep those same incentives for BNG to be delivered in this way that we think kind of works best and has a good kind of balance between those different elements. Also, I think that kind of using the statutory metric for NSIPs, a key point is really around enabling a single kind of shared market. So we're talking about the kind of offsite biodiversity gains. We're proposing the same metric, because then once BNG is live for NSIPs, NSIPs will be able to go and buy those kind of registered offsite biodiversity gains, and it is a kind of a simpler approach for habitat bank providers, offsite providers. They don't have to grapple with two different metrics and like have two distinct markets. We want one market for offsite gains, and we think kind of NSIPs will be able to kind of drive up demand for units as well, and kind of keep that market really working well.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point, especially, and I think that point about consistency. Would you be open for the consultation for, because sometimes the metric doesn't quite work for NSIPs. You know, there's a limited number of rows when you have like each individual parcel, when you have a massive scheme, so you have to aggregate that. Would that be useful to hear part of the consultation response? If people are listening in thinking, well, I've used the metric on an NSIP and there's various like adjustments you have to do, would that be useful?
Yes, definitely. So we have a consultation question in there, I think, around the metric. So although we don't want to change the kind of calculation, like the way the calculation works, and we want to keep those incentives in there, we want the metric to be the same. We are, in fact, actually proposing some kind of extra guidance on the metric. In particular, the area that we've identified that needs a change is around the spatial risk multiplier, and just adding some extra clarity for how NSIPs can apply that where their projects span multiple kind of LPA or national character area boundaries, because we know that's something that kind of NSIPs have been unsure how to kind of implement the spatial risk multiplier in that scenario. So we have set out a proposal to kind of simplify the approach there, but we're also very much welcome other views from kind of additional bits of guidance or like small additions, like you say, extra rows in the metric. Small changes like that don't actually change the fundamental kind of working of the metric. Very much welcome those, and we want to implement those to make it as easy as it can be for NSIPs to kind of use that that metric kind of smoothly.
Thank you, Nicole. So for people listening in, if you're like me and work with the metric on a daily basis, and there is a welcome, and thank you, Nicole, a welcome request for how can a metric work. It doesn't fundamentally change the metric, but just makes it usable for NSIPs. We've just had a point of clarification. I'm just looking at the questions. Is it Defra's view that any land that is used temporarily for construction and then restored and handed back to the landowner should be secured for 30 years? So typically that might be farmland where it would just be used for like a construction compound. The construction team would use it just for construction, and then it's handed back. So it's not part of the project, it's not part of the mitigation compensation. So in the metric, and farming land can be very valuable for ecological reasons, but in the metric, it tends to score quite low. So used for construction team then restore it and hand it back. Is the consultation saying that should be secured for 30 years to be counted in the metric, or are you seeking views on that?
So in the we've proposed, we do welcome, we welcome feedback on everything. What we've proposed is that anything that would be classed as a significant gain, so anything where you've got medium or high distinctiveness land, you're increasing the distinctiveness, or you're enhancing the habitat condition from poor to moderate or good, that they would be sort of generally classed as significant gains, and therefore they would need to be secured for 30 years. But if it's non-significant gains, so you're just retaining the value that was there, restoring it back to the previous value, or creating low distinctiveness habitat, and that's classed as non-significant gain, then that can count towards your 10% BNG, but it doesn't need to be secured.
Thank you, Chloe.
Okay,
Lucy, there's a lot of questions about McDonald cost.
Well, yes, I mean, I think cost is an interesting one, and I think the narrative, the wider narrative, often seems to alight on cost associated with nature, which is a real shame in terms of being able to also bring out the benefits associated with how BNG can drive changes. So as part of the consultation, there's a request for evidence about cost. Obviously, that's sort of part of it. Would Defra be also interested in hearing about return on investment, about value sort of driven out of it? So, for example, woodland creation, which can also provide natural flood management benefits.
Yes, we would love to hear about ROI and other benefits you're seeing from the BNG you're delivering. Definitely. The Dasgupta review showed that long-term economic growth is impossible on a degraded planet, and BNG for NSIPs helps to ensure that infrastructure development doesn't cause further degradation, but instead helps to halt the decline in nature and can create these other benefits that you're talking about. We would really welcome, examples, information, case studies, and all of that when you're responding to the consultation. We have a section on evidence, but as Lucy said, it doesn't need to be some huge review, but just what the information that you've got from the projects you've been working on, we'd really welcome. We've got sort of cost ratio examples from the Natural Capital Committee on when you invest in nature restoration projects, you've got a 2:1 to 9:1 cost benefit ratio improvement. So we would love to know kind of what sort of, if you do those kind of ROI figures, what figures do you put on perhaps like the community sort of buy-in benefits that you get from delivering BNG that help to sort of give you that acceptance of the project? Like what value can you put on that? Or indeed, the other sort of biodiversity benefit, climate adaptation benefits that you're getting from delivering your BNG. So we appreciate that it can be kind of commercial sensitivities around sharing information, and really happy to talk to people who might think, we've got something to share, but we're a little bit worried about this or that. Please do come and talk to us. We've got our lead analyst as well, who would love to have a conversation. So please do use the consultation response opportunity, but if you'd prefer to sort of have a conversation with us in a meeting, yeah, we'd love that as well.
That's great, Chloe, and I think that's a really great invitation to offer to people. And I think also if people have a view that actually making something more overt within the policy around maybe more of a linkage between BNG and sort of value, if that would be useful, because I think sometimes policy can be a helpful lever to be able to bring forward things. You know, if people are able to share those views, because obviously policy is there to drive improvement. You know, so I think this is a good opportunity. There were a couple of questions in the chat that I also just did want to just perhaps pick up on, and they're points around sort of coordination and cooperation and kind of collaboration. And one of the questions refers to around LPAs and them sort of cooperating, and whether there is opportunity for a kind of a single sort of biodiversity game plan across, where have I gone in terms of what that was? Yes, a sort of a joint game plan across LPAs. But I think there was also, sorry, the joint one was around multiple NSIPs. We've obviously got a lot of development that's happening at the moment, and we're seeing development NSIPs that are happening in the same geographical area. And what your view is around where there might be multiple projects, that something that looks a more conjoined way of expressing what the overall BNG is, whether there have been any thoughts around opportunities to express that in any kind of joint way between NSIPs.
I think Nicole might have frozen.
Oh,
So
I'm back on.
Who's
There.
back?
I think
Okay.
I can try and answer that question. Although I did miss a little bit. My Wi-Fi's are maybe not yeah, playing up a little bit. But I think I heard most of this, and I have seen the question in the chat as well. So I think it's a really interesting idea around, yeah, NSIPs that are coming in together or linking up in a certain kind of cluster, and how BNG can be done in a more coordinated way. I think that's something for us to take away and think about. The only thing I would say is that obviously the way that NSIPs come through the consenting process and the way the kind of primary legislation works, we do need to make sure that each individual application going through the NSIP consenting process can show that they are delivering 10% BNG to like meet the legal requirement. So we'd have to look at how we can do that whilst also allowing for coordination, which I think could be quite complicated, but I think it's a really important point that's been raised, and yeah, we'll definitely have a think about that.
Great.
Great, thank you. Okay, 2 final questions. As you mentioned, we've had just over a year of BNG in the Town and Country Planning Act, and there's certainly a lot of lessons for us in industry, but I'm just really interested from a Defra point of view, what sort of lessons that you think have learned for the rollout of BNG for NSIPs, and what happens from here on in. So we've got the consultation, and then we've got the go live date in May. Is there any programme or any dates that you can refer to?
Yeah, shall I take that one? Thanks, Julia. So yes, I actually led the rollout of BNG for TCPA. So I'm trying to learn the lessons that we've learned from that experience. And one of those really, really key things is we intend to get sort of clear guidance out with as much notice ahead of May 2026 as we possibly can. Obviously, we need to confirm the final policy approach through the government response, which will come after the consultation. Something that I've been reflecting on while we've been having this discussion is that it's all very well and good for us to be asking these questions, but you guys need that policy clarity. So whilst it's excellent for you guys to feed in, we then need to reflect what's been fed in with a sort of clear and firm policy as quickly as we possibly can. So we'll get that government response out, and then we will follow that with guidance on sort of specific issues that have been sort of raised with us through conversations. What we'd really, really like to do is get that guidance out, like I said, sort of with as much time as possible before May 2026, and then do sessions like this, so webinars, roundtables, that sort of thing, really digging into that guidance to just try to provide as much clarity as we can on the approach ahead of May. I think something else that we've learned from TCPA is that we can't possibly imagine all circumstances and sort of preempt everything that's going to come up after implementation. So again, from TCPA, I think we've kept really close relationships with everyone involved in that side of the process, learning from that. And you'll have seen the consultation that's come out on small, medium and brownfield sites. Lots of that is sort of reflecting the conversations that we've had with stakeholders on that side. So we'll want to continue to learn after implementation, continue that conversation and sort of see how things go.
Thank you, Lucy, because I think a lot of people are thinking, okay, so now what happens? We're just going to see you in May. So that's really helpful to know, and really, really welcome as well, because I think you're right. You know, the moment that we think we've given you all the responses is the moment that in June we'll have an NSIP and it will bring up something completely different. So to keep that conversation, to keep those case studies is really, really welcome. Thank you. Right, I think, is there anything you would like to talk about that we've not yet discussed in the final 2 minutes before we hand over?
I don't think so. No, I mean, I think we'll sort of look through the questions in the chat because I've been trying to do that, but it's difficult to multitask. So we could always come back in writing on some of those if we haven't picked them up. And yeah, just really encourage everyone to respond to the consultation and feel free to sort of pick up with us separately if that's useful as well.
No, and thank you, Lucy, Chloe and Nicole, and certainly I've been also looking at what's been coming up in the chat, and I think there's some really interesting sort of, you know, some common points, some of which you've covered already, others which I think will bring some additional kind of perspectives that people are bringing. But yeah, I guess just to reiterate, as has been said several times, around the important thing of making sure that people take the opportunity of the consultation to provide you with as much information and perspectives and thoughts and questions and, you know, perhaps issues arising from their experience, because it will all make policy and the implementation of policy better for the outcomes that we're all trying to achieve. So thank you.
Right, next session, Lucy.
And over now to industry, which will be a fascinating sort of segue from hearing about policy to now hearing about some of the experience that some of our infrastructure providers have been having over the recent years. So we'd like to welcome our guest speakers. So we've got Chris Gerard from Anglian Water, Tom Clancy from National Highways, and Kat Stanhope from National Grid. So can I ask each of you just to briefly introduce yourself?
I'll go first. Yes, morning everyone. It's great to be here today. My name's Chris Gerard. I'm the head of landscape transformation at Anglian Water, so very involved in delivering a lot of the company's biodiversity work and work very closely with our supply chain on biodiversity net gain.
Tom.
Okay. Yeah. Hi all. Tom Clancy, head of environmental delivery at National Highways. So I oversee our biodiversity policy and delivery of our KPI.
And morning, I'm Kat Stanhope. I'm Strategic BNG Manager at National Grid. So I deal with the strategy and implementation of BNG across our large strategic infrastructure projects, most of which are NSIP.
Wonderful. Great panel that we've got this morning. So Chris, Tom, Kat, your organisations from the water, transport and energy sectors have been undertaking BNG on NSIPs on a voluntary basis for several years now. What have you found have been the positives from BNG and your experiences? And is there support for a move to a mandatory framework? And if so, why? So can I come to Chris first and then Kat and then Tom? Oh, sorry, I've done it the wrong way around. Sorry, Tom, can I come to you first?
Yeah,
then Chris, then Kat.
No problem. Yeah, so we have been an early adopter of BNG at NH. So we've built BNG into our KPI for road period 2, which was 2020 until March of this year. So what that has achieved for us is that it's driven the prioritization of funding within the organisation, but also that's got buy-in from senior leaders, so from our exec and leadership, but also buy-in from our regulators as well in support of doing this work. So I think that's been one positive. I think the other one has been the shift in the way that designers and project managers, delivery directors think about nature on their projects. So I think previously it might have been seen as something they need to do to get through the planning system, a bit of a bolt on, and really prior to 2020. But what we're seeing now is nature being integral to how projects are designed and delivered. I think one great example of this is the M25 Junction 10. So if you look at that, it's almost described as a nature restoration project with a junction improvement. And I would encourage anyone to have a look at the information on our website. And it's essentially the junction improvement built around a green bridge that connects two severed parts of a triple SI. So I think it's a great example, actually, of what we can achieve on major enhancements when we think slightly differently about nature and putting it central to delivery of the scheme. And some anecdotal evidence, really. I go around and I speak to the delivery directors and the project managers, and I think one who I know quite well says some of the biodiversity enhancements that he's delivered on the A30, which had a green bridge as well, and then multiple improvements spanning out into the adjacent countryside and network. He said that's some of the best work that he's delivered in his career, the most rewarding and engaging work that he delivered in his career. And he was an engineer. So I think some of the positives of adopting the voluntary approach early on has been shifting the mindset of how we think about delivering this work. And the result has been that we had a major projects program that was forecasting significant losses in BNG terms, but actually by the end of the road period, into the 5 years, it's resulted in a net gain. So, and that's been achieved through changing that mindset, designing more sensitively in the projects that we deliver, and choosing more sensitive, appropriate options. So I think it's had a massive shift and been really positive for us. So with all that in mind, do we support a move to mandatory? Absolutely. Yeah, we do support it. Albeit, I suppose we'll come on to talk about some of the nuances about how we do that.
Indeed. I love that the gains actually are around people's mindset. I think we talk about it in terms of biodiversity gains, but actually the mindset gains is great. Chris, can I come to you?
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. I agree with everything that Tom said there. So we're fully supportive of BNG as a policy. Anglian Water, it's back to back with our purpose to bring environmental and social prosperity to our region as well. And so mandatory BNG, which brings with it, additional constraints and rules and risks, just bumps nature further up the agenda, which is great. It means we can get ecologists and environmental managers involved in schemes earlier point, and it's a good kind of organising principle to help us not only think about how obviously we comply with BNG as a legislative driver, but also wider nature requirements. But the sorts of NSIPs that we're delivering, the two at the moment are two big reservoirs in Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire, are really place-making opportunities, which is something I might return to as a theme. So as well as delivering the asset and its core purpose, which is to provide customers with drinking water, these are going to be major socio-economic and environmental projects in their own right, with massive impacts on the landscape and their local communities. So BNG is a really great opportunity to think about how we design right from the start to maximise these wider benefits that we get from doing nature really, really well. So it's great. So do we support it for NSIPs? Of course, absolutely, no doubt about it. But there are some very big challenges with just applying a sort of TCPA type of approach onto NSIPs. So it's really great to hear how open Defra are about the questions they're asking and the views that they want from everybody. So we really do need to talk to them and give some really good responses on some of the things which no doubt we'll be talking about in the next few minutes.
And I think some of the questions we've had already sort of just really evidence that point. Kat, can I come to you?
Yeah, sure. Again, second everything that the other two guys have said, but National Grid's been applying 10% BNG to all relevant construction projects since 2021. And again, it's part of our corporate commitments. And National Grid is going to have a huge increase in infrastructure development over the next 5-6 years. And there's investments of over £30 billion to meet government net zero targets. So again, the infrastructure that we implement has got climate positive change, and some of that investment will be to deliver BNG. So there's a really huge opportunity to make positive change for nature and the wider environmental and societal benefits via infrastructure. So National Grid does support the mandatory move to a framework, and there are several reasons for that. It does reduce the queries about why money is being spent on BNG. Sorry to bring it back to money, but in the context of increasing cost of living and rising energy bills, having it mandatory changes the conversation on that. And it also gives you certainty over the approach to BNG on NSIPs. And that makes our business forecasting easier. So if we know what we need to apply, we can plan for it. The uncertainty previously has been quite difficult and a challenge. And it helps the conversation with stakeholders with that consistent approach underpinned by legislation and guidance. And it will also help us, with it being a statutory requirement, it helps to drive the changes that we will need in the business for the management and monitoring of on-site habitats, because quite a lot of additional resources needed for that. But one of the things that's been a game changer of using in the lessons learned has been the use of the metric, and because that has helped highlight the consequences of routing and siting our infrastructure to avoid valuable habitats. And it does it in a way that you can see the outcomes in terms of the biodiversity units and the cost requirements. And that's actually quite useful for communicating with non-environmental professionals. And also the lessons learned for the previous developments before we had a metric. Mitigation and compensation was unlikely, not just for National Grid, but other developments, to have been achieving no net loss because there was no method of quantification. So it's really up the game. And it does provide that level of consistency between projects and consistency of reporting outcomes to compare projects. So again, the application of the metric and the current proposals in the consultation, although we broadly support it, there does need to be changes, we think, to be fit for purpose, particularly for linear electricity infrastructure, and some of the things that Chloe and Nicole talked about earlier.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's and thank you all for summarising that. So we have a broad level support. We have 3 organisations who've been undertaking BNG on a voluntary basis for NSIPs for a long time. But your point, Chris, about this needs to be fit for purpose. It's not just taking Town and Country Planning Act, and we also have a Defra team who are really asking for our responses. Can we then touch on probably going to be the big one, which is the baseline? So in the consultation response, we have the proposed baseline of the draft order limits, which can be different from the construction footprint. And you know what, it's really interesting when Defra said they have asked this question, but the order limits gives clarity and consistency, whereas what we haven't done as industry is propose what that alternative is. So I think it's probably on us to say, well, actually, what is that alternative that would be clear and consistent between organisations? Can I come to Kat first, then Chris, and then Tom? So Kat, I think especially for the energy sector, what's the alternative? Well, do you agree with draft order limits from BNG? And if you don't, what's the alternative that would be proportionate but also clear and consistent?
Sure. So particularly for electricity infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, and I'm talking there about our overhead power lines and the underground cables, using the development consent order limits as the baseline would substantially inflate the biodiversity units needed to achieve BNGs. So I'm sure a lot of people on the call already know, but the order limits define the overall area in which the development can be built and which the projects can take land rights to facilitate development. And there was discussion about that earlier. And due to the detailed design not being available for all elements at the point of application, the order limits does provide that degree of flexibility in construction. And the order limits are usually much larger than the construction footprint. So looking at some of our projects, the difference between the order limits and the maximum construction footprint can be 50%. So that would mean a doubling of the biodiversity units needed to achieve BNG and the associated land costs and land needs for that. And also the ecologists would spend a lot of time mapping and calculating habitats that will never be directly affected by construction. And the Defra team mentioned it earlier that in the current metric user guide, the condition of the retained habitat within the baseline, if you can't secure that over the project timeframe, it should be considered lost or reduced condition. But over much of the land within the order limits for National Grid, we won't enact land rights that would give us control over how it was managed. And just one final point on that is, There's the Electricity Act, which means National Grid have to develop our transmission network in an efficient, coordinated and economic manner. Because the BNG that National Grid provides, it's consumer funded, it's funded by all of our electricity bills. So we need to seek to avoid unnecessary spend of that money, which would happen, we think, if order limits was used as a baseline. So we would suggest that the maximum construction footprint was used for that calculation.
Kat, thank you. So it's the maximum construction footprint. Chris.
Yes, thank you. Some really useful comments. And well, I think there's a fundamental principle underlying this which worries me, which is the mitigation hierarchy, which is like the fundamental principle for avoiding environmental damage when we're building stuff. So if we really follow the mitigation hierarchy and we're working to the order limits, we're going to have a lot of land that we haven't touched, and yet we're still being expected to deliver BNG against some of that land, which means it's not fully back to back with the mitigation hierarchy. So it kind of penalises, to a degree at least, organisations when they take specific steps to not impact habitats. To illustrate, we would use directionally drilling techniques to go under habitats, including rivers, maybe hedgerows, ditches, things like that, so that habitat isn't touched at all, but will still be expected to deliver biodiversity uplift against what are some of the most expensive biodiversity units currently on the market. So for that reason, I don't think the order limits is operable at all, really. I think this is, if not potentially the most significant issue that Defra, I think, needs to address. So I think what we need to be doing is looking at the measured losses, the actual impacts of the development. We also look at those habitats that aren't going to be impacted, but then might be part of the plan for enhancement to deliver on-site BNG, and use that as the boundary for what's included in the baseline. Chloe made the point earlier about it being, the order limits at least being a bit more transparent and maybe sort of convenient. But actually, I don't think that trumps the very, very significant cost. And we're talking about many, many millions of pounds that will fall upon customers one way or other in terms of delivering BNG against habitats that were not impacted. So I think we need to hand the kind of challenge back to industry, to ecologists and environmental managers, to come up with practical ways in which we can still deliver transparently BNG against a different sort of boundary. It's not as if NSIPs were easy to do in the first place, right? So I don't think this is significantly adding to the complication of the challenge that we already have. So I think that's the approach that we need to take.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Tom.
Yeah, I think I would echo those comments. If you look at the nature of large highway enhancements, the order limits includes a lot of land that we might not affect, and certainly lots of land that is temporarily affected and then handed back. So I certainly echo the thoughts of the others that have made. And we are in challenging economic times with spending reviews and things like that. So we are funded through central government, and I think if there are projects that are carrying large economic costs due to higher baseline, then sometimes it can affect the economic viability of projects. So we would definitely appeal for a more proportionate approach, I think, along the lines already suggested. But I would certainly be interested in engaging with others in workshops to come up with the right sort of wording and around this, because it is critical to how we go forward, I think.
Yeah, and Tom, thank you, because I think that this is the call for us as well, in terms of, maximum construction footprint from CAT. Is that the same as water and transport? So to really come up with, okay, what do we think that consistency would be? One thing to ask you all is that biodiversity net gain on NSIPs is that opportunity to have strategic outcomes for nature. We've heard from the Defra team that it will be 10% project wide, and often under Town and Country Planning Act, it absolutely needs to be local. We're having all the the local nature recovery strategies come through. What's your what would you like to see from policy to make sure that we're enabling the strategic outcomes for nature for biodiversity net gain, but balancing that with stakeholder concerns that will have massive losses in one areas and gains all the way up there? And noting, and actually, Kat, we were talking about this the other day, that actually the 10% builds on the localised mitigation compensation. So it is the build on from what should be the local level mitigation compensation. But I'm just wondering what you would like to see in policy to enable that come through. If we start with Chris and then Kat and then Tom.
Well, I think the consultation is a really great start because it's proposing that the biodiversity gain hierarchy doesn't need to apply in the same way for NSIPs, and I really support that. In fact, I support a kind of softening of the biodiversity gain hierarchy under Town Country Planning Act as well, at least to a degree, and particularly for our on-site development, which we are going to be building on in the future anyway. So it makes sense for us to automatically start to think about whether offsite is the more appropriate thing to do. So I do support that, and I support the proposals for the gain to be looking across the LPAs that are impacted, or across the national character areas, or across the water body's operational catchments. That gives a bit more flexibility. Again, for our schemes, which are going to be fantastic opportunities for creating amazing places for people and wildlife, that gives us flexibility to really plan not just the footprint of our reservoirs themselves, but all the kind of hinterland around that. It gives us the ability to plan physical connections to local communities, so accessing our sites through green corridors and things like that. And it also enables us to think about the catchments that our water is going to be coming from as well. So I really support that, and I just encourage Defra to think how far they can go to enable our freedom to plan at a landscape scale, thinking nature first, but with people strongly behind it, and how we can support things like local nature recovery strategies. And of course, behind all this is the Lawton principles of bigger, better, more, and join. So these should be kind of the organising characteristics that we're able to deploy in order to create these amazing places. So I think that the consultation has really opened the door to enabling us to think really creatively and at a landscape scale in that way, and to encourage more discussion as to how we can push that even further.
Yeah, Chris, that's really positive. Kat?
Yes, very similar, but for the energy infrastructure. So the national policy statements for energy have said previously that BNG can be delivered wholly or partially off-site. So we really support that flexibility and proportionate approach being applied in the legislation. And just on the local versus the wider strategic. So National Grid may site BNG locally and on site around assets like substations in locations where it can also meet requirements for mitigation, like landscape screening or protected species mitigation. But it must be placed where it doesn't restrict future site expansion or future connections into the substation. So that does restrict on site. So echo kind of Chris's point about flexibility in the current regime. But again, for the overhead lines and underground cables, they can run for hundreds of kilometres across third-party land, the majority in agricultural use, that will return to that use post-development. So for the kind of the money for off-site BNG there, that huge opportunity for strategic landscape scale delivery in BNG, in areas with best outcomes for nature, which aim for the Lawton principles, and which can be more efficiently managed in that way as well. It's quite difficult to efficiently manage small bits of scattered habitat across the landscape. And that strategic scale also gives us the opportunity to work with expert partners to drive those best outcomes for nature and the best value for money, rather than National Grid acquiring lots of land to deliver BNG in-house through our contractors. We can't do that alone. So we need partners and providers, landowners, to come on board to make sure the land is available in the right place at the right time to deliver that, and really need to work with stakeholders across our routes to buy into that landscape scale ambition. And just as a minor point, we also need funding from our regulator to be able to invest in a BNG at the right time. Our NSIPs are very long timescale projects, and the timing of funding versus the timing of when we need to secure off-site BNG is quite critical. And having legislation will help that.
Yeah, especially for early provision. Yeah, that's good. Tom, what's your take on that one?
Well, to build on the points, I think I'd like to see the policy being really ambitious. So we've all got our programs of delivery and NSIPs, and we've, in the last 5 years, we've gone about that, and we've delivered our projects and delivered some big gains, and that's been great. But just building on the bigger, better, more joined up theme, if all of the client side requirements could be articulated and known and combined even, then you have something that you could really deliver at scale at landscape scale. So being able to articulate all of our client needs together, I think, and you can look to do something like nature investment zones, which is coming out of the Rebuilding Nature initiative. And I think if we can get to that space where we're working together and that's being driven by policy, then the scale of delivery and outcomes that we can achieve together would be quite impressive, I think. So.
I think, and building on all of your points, and we've talked about sort of enabling that strategic kind of landscape scale achievement. We're forecasting that, the forecasting is a large demand for offsite BNG provision from local BNG markets. What's your experience been of the BNG supply chain, and what can we do as an infrastructure development industry to better support the supply chain to really kind of step up and meet the challenge and opportunity that the schemes that your 3 organisations and others like you will be needing to be able to achieve? Tom, can I come to you first, and then Kat and Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think our experience on the voluntary basis that we've done over the last 5 years has been really positive. And I think the reason for that is that we've been able to give stability and certainty to the supply chain. So we have a 5-year funding cycle, and that's enabled us to build programs of work over multiple years through feasibility, design, and delivery. And the outcome of that has been that as an organisation, we've delivered about 6,500, still being audited, but in that region, 6,500 biodiversity units with conservation supply chain partners. And we've only been able to do that because we've given them the certainty on what's coming, and they've been able to build up their resource and knowledge to meet that demand. So I think that's really important. So it's been a really positive experience. How can we improve on that and build on that going forward? Well, I'll go back to the point I made on the previous question. If the client side need is well articulated and coordinated, then the supply side can look at that and then really scale up what they need to do. So I think we can give them that certainty, and then together the outputs will come, I think.
Right. Kat?
Very similar, actually. We've seen the supply chain really maturing, and more providers and broker type outfits are always coming on the scene. And the difficulty is we need to do that forecasting. What habitat types, biodiversity units, where do we need them, so the market can gear up. And as I said before, it's quite difficult to forecast with accuracy for large projects with a long design development programme what we will need. But we're just National Grid for non-NSIP projects, for our smaller projects, we're just finalising a carbon nature framework, which will include biodiversity unit providers. And we're looking at the lessons learned from that to build something in a similar mechanism for a pool of high quality integrity offsite BNG suppliers for our BNG. But part of supporting the supply chain is to have mechanisms which gives us assurance that the integrity of providers is high, but doesn't make that process overly onerous to suppliers, because we want to invite charitable organisations, SMEs, to become suppliers. And as the market's still evolving, we want to keep flexibility in for new people coming into the market. So there's more farm consortiums and farm clusters coming in as diversification of their business, and we want to make it open to them. And also the market rates keep changing, and we have been, as Tom said, we have been talking to other infrastructure promoters about whether we can pool resources for different geographical areas to get that bigger BNG off-site provision. That can be very difficult because the different infrastructure we've got different legislation, policy, regulation and procurement rules. And we have talked about, wouldn't it be great if we had something like, I'll call it a BNG supermarket, I think somebody else called it supermarket, where infrastructure promoters could identify those future needs, providers could be pre-vetted and then could bid for where the BNG is in the right place to have the best outcomes for nature, and can also demonstrate that value to environment and communities. And that would really give the market some stability to build, because they have to buy land sometimes, or take out leases to then do habitat work. So it's quite an initial significant investment for them. So they need to know that that money is going to come to them from somewhere.
Absolutely. And Chris, can I finally come to you just before we wrap up?
Just a quick couple of builds on that. So we have been engaging with landscape recovery projects and farm clusters around the region to let them know the sorts of things that we think we'll be needing in the future, and also what our wider priorities are. So if we can invest in BNG, for example, in drinking water catchments, we'll get a wider water resilience that will be good for the business as well. So starting to target where we would ideally like to see things happen. The point I make is that there are these sort of emerging regional nature groups coming. As a meeting on Monday in Birmingham to talk about that, which people here might be attending as well. And I think that's really interesting because it gives a kind of this subnational opportunity for collaboration between supply and demand to try and come together and support a collective BNG market. So I'm really keen to see what comes out of that, because I think that could be a real help to moving the BNG market forward.
Thank you.
Chris, Kat, Tom, thank you very much for the industry perspective. So broad level support for biodiversity gain on NSIPs, but it needs to be fit for purpose, pragmatic and work, and then we can achieve some great outcomes for nature. Thank you very much all. Right, our final session is with Nick White from Natural England and Tom Butterworth. Thank you very much for joining us, Nick and Tom. So to start off with, and I know you've been listening in and listening to everything. Nick, what is going to be Natural England's role on mandatory BNG for NSIPs?
Morning, everybody. So Natural England has quite a different role when it comes to NSIPs compared to Town and Country Planning Act. So we're a statutory consultee engaging with NSIPs more generally. And we're not a statutory consultee for most planning applications, but that doesn't mean we're going to be required to be consulted in any more detail than we currently are when it comes to nationally significant infrastructure projects. So we don't need to check people's metrics, etc. We're involved in EIA discussions, we're involved in discussions around protected sites, etc. So we anticipate that our engagement with NSIPs will be pretty much along the lines as it is currently. We have a relationship both in terms of nature, but also in terms of landscape and things like that as well. But there's no kind of additional requirements that NSIPs will have to kind of engage on specific aspects of BNG with us.
Great. Tom, earlier we heard Defra is interested to know about the costs of BNG on NSIPs. What's your take on that cost point on BNG for NSIPs?
So I think it's really important that we take on board the learning that we've got, from all of the work, the fantastic work that people like the folks we've been hearing from today have been suggesting. And if we get that right, if we get this adaptation right, then I think it's really important that we're clear about the relationship with what NSIPs are doing already in relation to these costs. So what I mean by that is very often we already have requirements on these projects for accessible green space, for landscape requirements, for areas to manage flood risk, for protected species. And biodiversity net gain sits really well with those requirements. And so it needs to be seen as an integrated part of that. And because of that, it's really important that we don't separate out the cost and say, well, there's the BNG cost, and there separately, there's the cost for providing accessible green space, and separately, there's the cost for flood risk using natural flood risk management, that we need to look at those together. And in that light, sometimes, not always, sometimes actually the cost is very low for delivering biodiversity net gain. I'm working on several NSIPs at the moment that probably the cost is tied up with all of those other things together. BNG is having an influence, it's helping the design, it's informing and helping us take those mitigation hierarchy steps and deliver positive outcomes. But in some of the examples, there's not an additional significant cost. It's tied up together with high quality design. That's not the case everywhere, but we just need to be really clear on how we communicate those costs.
And I think that communication point is a really valuable one, because I think so much of the narrative from perhaps in the wider press and the wider sort of discussions around nature has been focusing on cost and being able to ensure that the benefit side of it, the outcomes and that multifaceted and interconnected way in which nature can drive and connect with those other aspects, I think is absolutely vital, you know, in that narrative that we can do that. Nick, I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, just to add to what Tom was saying. So we do often think of BNG in terms of costs, and I understand why people kind of jump to that, but it's also, there are financial opportunities associated with it as well. So Defra earlier were talking about how the requirement is for a 10% gain. That's going to be the legal minimum. But we certainly have seen, we're aware of NSIP projects that have delivered in excess of that, and for some that's easier than for others. But one of the interesting things, talking about, you know, the supply chain and availability of offsite, we've got the first infrastructure projects appearing on the National Register with land available for sale for biodiversity gain. For other developments, it's quite possible for NSIPs over-delivering on the BNG requirement to potentially use that as a source of revenue for them as well. And kind of long term, they're going to be there for the long term. The habitat's going to be there for the long term. So there's opportunities that come with it, as well as the kind of the kind of financial costs of habitat works at times.
Great. Okay. There are clearly technical aspects to BNG, and many of those on the call will have been working with that. But what do you consider is most important from the successful design and implementation of BNG on NSIPs? And Nick, I wonder if I can come to you first, and then Tom.
Yeah, sure. So I've had the pleasure of working with Tom and Julia for many, many years now. And one of the mantras amongst us all has always been, think about it early. The earlier you can think about biodiversity net gain, the more you can get collaboration going between the different kind of project teams, the better. So don't just think this is an ecology challenge. Bring in landscape professionals, bring in engineers, bring in others, as well, bring in the contractors as well, because they'll have a lot of experience in subcontractors in managing what's the art of the possible. So that early thinking and collaboration, I think, are key to kind of delivery of successful outcomes.
Tom.
And what that early thinking does is it allows us to avoid those high value habitats, impact on the lower quality ones, which suddenly makes it much easier to deliver the biodiversity net gain outcomes. And I just want to reinforce a point that Kat alluded to earlier, which is that early intervention may well be earlier than we think about at the moment. So for the housing developers, taking this from the TCPA work, I know a lot of housing developers are now thinking about this before they buy the land. From the point Kat made was, if we can work the funding mechanisms out right, and we can deliver before we get anywhere near having a negative impact, that creates a huge boon for biodiversity. Great benefit if we're also opening those places up for the local people. They get the benefit of that straight away rather than having to wait for the benefit coming through the development over a much longer time frame. And it gives the benefit to within the metric, makes it much easier to deliver biodiversity net gain. So I would say the early engagement for me is even coming earlier than I perhaps ever thought. You know, if we can get those strategic sites delivering gain now, it's going to be much easier to deliver.
And just in terms of what we're seeing on the TCPA side, obviously it's too early to be talking much about the ecology. Yeah, sites are only just, the habitats are only just starting to be created. But what we're definitely seeing, particularly with bigger projects, is that, to Tom's point, that the habitat that previously might have been routinely cleared and just got rid of, people are retaining that where they can and looking to work with it as well. And I know from other examples, I remember having a conversation with East West Rail where they were highlighting a conversation between the ecology team and the engineers around an access route, and you know, the assumption was the route was going to go there, but actually that would have had quite an impact in terms of the biodiversity value and the kind of impacts their ability to achieve their own kind of biodiversity gain ambitions. Well, does the access route have to go there? Could it go slightly to the left? And actually doing that has a much lower nature impact. Yep, that was perfectly possible. So having those conversations just to kind of tweak and change design slightly so that can still deliver the kind of physical requirements you need, but whilst minimizing the kind of biodiversity impacts that perhaps might not have been thought about in that way in the past.
And I think just thinking from some of our work and the practical side of things, I think it's giving an opportunity to really empower the voice of the ecologists and the environmentalists to be able to input into those design conversations in a way that actually enables them to have confidence to say, there are different ways. And actually the point that Tom made around what he's seeing in terms of the designers and the engineers who are actually embracing this. So I think in many respects we're pushing against an open door of people who want to do better. They just perhaps hadn't really understood how. So I think that's a really nice sort of leveling perhaps of the playing field. So yeah, Julia, I wonder if you've got any sort of final kind of thoughts and observations.
Yeah, and actually, I was going to touch on the metric. So, Tom, back in the day, we actually started with the biodiversity metric for large national infrastructure projects, and shout out to all the pilots that we worked with, the original East West Rail, Greater West, Thames Link programme. And then obviously it went to Town and Country Planning Act, and now I feel like it's coming full circle. But it needs to be a metric that works when it's the big stuff. What's your take on that one?
I think this is a really important point. And so if we could redo this, I would have started with the legislation on the large infrastructure projects first, because you're absolutely right. It was Transport for London, Network Rail, Highways England, SSE, all of those organizations, yes, and Berkeley Group as well. But it was a lot of them were the large infrastructure organizations that were developing this approach. We were developing this approach together with them. And so the metric originally was set up specifically for these types of projects. So we know it can work. We know it can land really good quality projects right the way through, from optioneering right the way through to long-term delivery. And I like that point in the consultation, actually, where that's set out as a nice diagram. But it does need adapting back to some of the ways of working that we were using originally. And I think we've heard those articulated really well today. And isn't it fantastic that Defra are so open to hearing this from everybody? This is our opportunity to use all of that significant amount of evidence we've got. I dare not try and say how many years we've been working on it, but number of years we've been doing this, that we can bring to the table and say, this works. We need to adapt it, but this works. And the order limits is critical. There are some other tweaks as well, but that's really, really crucial.
I'll ask you both, what do you think about the advantage of sector-specific sort of biodiversity net gain for NSIPs versus consistency and clarity? Because we do get a lot of differences, obviously, between energy and then water. You might have a large reservoir, or we've got some water which is mainly tunneling, and I'm always torn between the need for consistency, standardization, just to have that certainty, but then BNG's got to work, and the advantage is that we're like thinking very specifically at that particular NSIP and making sure we're getting the best outcomes. Nick, where do you land with that?
So one of the very early conversations I remember us collectively having was thinking about, well, how can nature avoid some of the pitfalls that carbon got itself into when there were kind of a multiplicity of metrics, a multiplicity of different ways of engaging. So I think one of the brilliant things is we settled on a consistent approach. That was going to be really key. Yes, there's a recognition that there are particular kind of practices that are pertinent to certain sectors that may be less reflective of others. We have sought to try and adapt aspects of the metric to recognize that. So the kind of some of the changes for how it operates in the intertidal area, for example, is something that's sought to reflect that. But I think if we want people to be able to engage as easily as possible with the offsite market, if we want to be able to kind of benchmark industries between them, amongst themselves and with others as well, the more consistent something is, the easier that is to achieve. So I think if we were to lose that, I think that would lose some of the benefits that we've already seen BNG provide.
And just to add to that, if we're going to make this that supermarket, I think that may have been something Kat and I were talking about, the idea that you can go in and you can find the right biodiversity net gain requirements for your scheme easy because you've got a big market of opportunities. That works when we've got a consistent approach. It becomes much more difficult if we lose that consistency. And so we've got a little bit of a bump in the road in the sense of that market's got to set up. We've got a little bit of time that while those marketplaces are putting up their stalls and bringing the biodiversity net gain units to the market. But once that's running, that will actually be a real boon. It'll be much easier to deliver the outcomes we want to deliver.
And just in terms of that marketplace, if you think this, February last year, there was nothing on the national register. It just got going. There were no sites there at all. Just over a year since, we've now got close on 90 sites. There's another 20 being onboarded, over 3,300 hectares available. So there is, and there's things like open mosaic habitat, watercourse units becoming available. So yes, there are still some local pressures and challenges, but if you look at the picture nationally, actually there's we've got 10 years worth of supply of other neutral grassland probably. So there's a lot of habitat starting to come forward very quickly as well. But to go back to that supermarket analogy, I think we all can use the supermarket, but we're all buying in pounds. If we suddenly try to use krona or any other kind of currency, it doesn't work. So the more we can have a consistent mechanism to engage collectively, the better.
I know. I think there's going to be like a level, though, isn't there? There's like a level of consistency, and then I'm just wondering if there's like a detail underneath that might be specific for, you know, energy or water or the other ones as well, you know, in terms of that. So I think it's pushing that level of consistency down as far as possible, but then just making sure that there might be nuances, particularly around a particular sector, to make sure that it just works.
And the evidence coming back from the sectors is going to be critical in that.
Yeah.
So that feedback into the consultation is going to be really important. I have nervousness because I think one sector can actually have multiple different types of projects. And so I'm not sure that it's sector specific. But this is exactly the type of discussion we need to work through in the consultation, open up. And I would love to see, you know, the stuff that's going in there. I think that's going to be really exciting to see all the case studies come through, the challenges, and find solutions through that.
Yeah, and just a final point, because understandably that there's so much change going on at the moment. And we really wanted to come today to say, you know, this is such an open call for advice and opinions, and to really form, you know, biodiversity again for NSIPs, which is the next level in terms of, you know, what we've been working from. Out of everything that and I'm putting you two on the spot now, but after everything that you just heard today, or anything that you've read in the consultation, what would your advice be for people listening in thinking, okay, I'm going to respond, but I don't know the level of detail about the biodiversity metric, or, you know, I don't know energy, but I know water. Do you have any particular advice in terms of, you know, do they have to answer all the questions? Can they only answer a little bit? We just want to make sure that people feel that they have a voice and they can be heard. Nick?
So firstly, do respond. This is the most obvious thing. It's quite often people have views and comments and then forget to respond. So yeah, do respond. Do read the whole document as well, even if you think it's the bit you're reading maybe isn't relevant to you. You may actually discover actually there are elements to it. That's also true of the other consultation, by the way, as well. So you mentioned at the outset there's 2 consultations. Do have a look at the second one for minor, medium, and brownfield sites. There are aspects of that are pertinent to NSIPs as well. But don't feel you need to necessarily answer everything either.
And then just to add to that, I would say, certainly don't feel that you need to answer everything. But when you do answer, try not to just copy someone else's answer and stick it in. Make it your answer. I know it's very easy to go, well, what is everybody else saying? Oh, well, I agree with whoever it might be. I'll drop that in. Make it your answer and give case studies, examples, even if it's just a few lines. Having done sitting on the other side of this, I remember that changes things. If you've got a real example, it's much more easy to go, right, okay, there's a clear path here that we can see, or a clear issue or a clear opportunity. So add those case studies in, please.
Yeah, and actually, Tom, thank you, because I think also, you know, the Defra team have been very clear that if it's commercially sensitive, they're willing to meet and have that discussion, or, you know, just an anonymous case study. So it doesn't have to be like, you know, the academic rigorous publication. It can just be that. Nick, Tom, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for joining us. Right, to wrap up, Lucy.
Wow. There have been some brilliant sort of insights that we've got from industry. It was great to get the Defra team sort of sharing more of their sort of feedback just in terms of what's underpinning this. And I think really the opportunity that we had at the end there, just to sort of be able to sort of play with some of those things that had come up, but very rich content, very rich sort of discussion. And I think hopefully this is all going to be leading to the kind of responses, and I think the bits that Nick and Tom said at the end, really, really valuable. And looking at some of the things in the questions, I think there's so much sort of knowledge and thoughts and information that's out there. Just to be able to get that in is going to help us shape something which, I think it's exciting, really exciting.
It is, and thank you, Lucy, for sharing this with me, because we work a lot, and I might have the biodiversity net gain expertise, but you always see it from a really interesting business perspective, and just to achieve that balance between what could work from a BNG or a metric or biodiversity gain plan, but also what can work from a business perspective, and being able to understand like return on investment and everything like that. So everyone, thank you very much for joining us. Please do respond. I know that there's a lot going on, and we're certainly grappling with it in terms of just the amount of policy change, but we do have an opportunity to shape and influence biodiversity net gain for nationally significant infrastructure projects. So you don't have to respond to every question, you can respond to just the ones that you know, and you can also submit evidence and case studies, be anonymous, or if it's too commercially sensitive, thank you very much to the Defra team for that willingness to engage. We have seen a lot of your questions, and we haven't appreciate we haven't answered every single one. But personally, I will make sure that we talk to them. We go through them, and I know the Defra team are here as well, so we can pick that up separately behind the scenes. So for all of your questions that have come in, we will take a note of that behind the scenes, and we'll certainly go through that. But thank you for joining us. Please do respond to the consultation. I hope this was of interest, and we will see you again shortly. Thank you. Thanks again, Lucy.
Thanks, Julia.